Hi, I'm Emily from Life So Savory, and today I'm going to show you how to make a quilted iPad cover. Actually, it can be for any electronic device that you want. It could even be a computer sleeve if you made it a little bit bigger, or a laptop sleeve. We're going to be using the log cabin style of quilting today, and I've pre-cut some strips of fabric. I've started with 2 squares that will be our center, and they are 3 inches square. And then I've cut some longer strips of fabric that are 3 inches wide, and we'll trim the length as we go. So we're going to go ahead and get started sewing with the outer part of this cover. So we're going to begin with our 2 squares. This will be the center of our quilt, and we're going to place the 2 squares right sides together, and then we're just going to sew along one of the edges. You can use whichever seam allowance is comfortable for you, but I generally use about a 1/4 inch, which is standard when you're quilting. And the log cabin style quilt is a really fun and easy one if you're just starting out, because it just builds basic shapes around the center square. So after you have your 2 pieces sewn together, then we're going to take a 3rd piece and lay it along the long side of these 2 squares. So I'll use my button fabric. We're going to lay it along the 2 sides of the square. And when you're finished, here's where we'll trim our fabric. So you're going to open it up and then just trim the 2nd fabric. It doesn't have to be exact, you're just getting it pretty close. And open it up again, and now we're going to continue to build around our circle. So we did this side, now we're going to do the top. So you take your next piece of fabric, and you want to be a little bit aware of which color fabrics you're using to make sure that they go together, but in the end, this is going to be, just a mismatch of all coordinating fabrics as they go together. So we'll lay that, and then you continue to sew around. So just like if you were building a cabin out of logs, you would continue to build each layer of logs around in the circle as you build upward. We're going to be doing the same thing with our fabric. So again, open. Now we have another side that we're going to be laying our fabric on. And for this iPad case, we are looking for a final dimension of about 12 inches by 16 inches. You will want to, of course, adjust that for the size of the device that you are creating your cover for. You want to measure your device and then add about 1 inch seam allowance on all sides for the device. So again, our finished dimensions are going to be 12 by 16, and so that's what I'm building this quilt to be. So the next fabric in my pile is actually the same red as this one, so I'm going to skip over that and go with this one to keep our fabrics a little bit mixed up and varied. Again, if you are a quilter, which I'm not really, I just like to sew, you would probably be pressing each of these seams in between sewing, but with a little bit of finger pressing, you can get away with just pressing at the end. But I just want to let you know that that is an option to use your iron in between each of these seams. And now we can really see the design of this starting to come together. You can see our center and then the other fabrics as we're building around that middle. If you wanted to have a cutting board and rotary cutter also by your machine, you could also be using that to trim your fabric pieces as you're going around, or you can just use scissors like I've been doing. All right, so now we're gonna grab this red one that we left before, because I think this is a great spot for it. We'll lay it around that edge. Let's see this dark pin one, and we'll sew it on this side, and then I'm going to put another piece on that side and see how we're doing. You can adjust the width of your fabric to be small, to be, narrow or wider, depending on the look that you want for your little quilt design. These are 3-inch wide strips. On the example that I showed at the beginning, those were 2-inch wide strips, and the basic pattern is the same, but it does end up looking a little bit different just based on those widths. All right, so now let's measure and see how close we are to 16 inches. Looks like we're gonna have to add one more piece. All right, so we're at 14, so we will add one more piece to this side, and then we'll be able to move on from there. If you were really being exact and you wanted this to be the very center, you would probably add a half piece to each side of your design, so that it would be evenly centered, but for the sake of this, I'm just gonna add a strip to one side. Okay, so now let's go press this and cut it down to size. Okay, so we're going to press all of our seams. If you wanted to top stitch, you would do so before moving on, and you could top stitch each of your seams on this case, or do any other sort of quilting design that you wanted. All right, so we're going to take this and we're going to cut it to that 12 by 16 size that I was mentioning before, which will match the lining piece that I already have organized. Okay, and then I'll fold this in half. See, almost exactly the right size. Just trim off a little bit of the extra. Okay, so now before we put this on the outer part of our case, here's the lining, we're gonna do two things. One, we're gonna press over the top seam allowance like I did on this one, and the other thing we're gonna do is we're gonna fuse the foam to the fabric. So we're going to fuse this is fusible foam. You can use either single or double side fusible. This is only single side. And I like to iron on the fabric instead of the foam. I'm just always a little bit worried that the foam might melt or something. So if you do on the right side of the fabric, usually it fuses nicely and you don't have to worry about that. So you can see we have a seam allowance on all sides of the foam, and on the top, there's about 1.5 inches. And that's for us to put the snaps and other closure without having to worry about the foam getting in the way. Okay, so now that we have the foam fused, we're gonna fold over a seam allowance. This will make the final step of our sewing a lot simpler if we already have this folded over and pressed. Okay, oops. So now with right sides together, we are going to go and sew an L shape on this piece. Okay, so we want to take our top seam allowances that we pressed over and line those up before you sew down the side. The rest of it we can adjust later. And it might be a little tricky with the foam right there on the side But essentially you just want to keep it out of the seam, and hopefully your presser foot can kind of go over it. You can also use like a zipper foot or another narrow foot for your machine that would help keep that out of the way. Okay, so this will put the front of our cover together, and then from there we will put the lining inside to do the final stitching. All right, so we'll turn this right side out. And then I've already prepared the lining, which the top is folded over and the side is sewn as I just did on this one. And you will place that lining inside the main cover. And we're gonna line up the side seam and use some pins to hold it together. Okay, so now we're just gonna stitch around the top. And I'm using a pretty narrow seam allowance so that we can sew close to the edge and get those pieces, those two sides of the fabric attached together. You do want to make sure you're sewing through all those layers that you just pinned together. You don't want any holes in the top of your little case. All right, so now you can take your lining and sort of push it inside to get it all organized. And then you would come over and we would either put snaps or Velcro or whatever you want as a closure. We don't have the foam on the top layer, and that's to make putting the closure on easier. And then you would have a finished case that you could use for your electronics on the go.